Have you ever heard of the Night Witches? The Nazis feared them, whispering about witches in the sky. But they were real. These were Soviet women flying wooden planes in the dead of night, terrorizing the enemy with daring raids behind enemy lines. And when their targets exploded in fiery infernos, the planes would vanish without a trace. It was World War II, and the battle lines had been drawn. In the east, the forces of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union clashed in a brutal struggle that would become known as the Eastern Front. It was here where the war would be decided, and both sides committed their full might to destroy the other. And within this chaos, a new weapon emerged, an army of female bombers. This was the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. In the summer of 1941, the Germans had broken through the Soviet lines and were pushing deep into Russian territory. With each passing day, more and more land fell under the control of the invaders, and it seemed that nothing could stop them. That was when the Soviet leadership realized they needed to do something drastic to turn the tide of the war. They turned to an untapped pool of potential, the women of the motherland. Thousands of young women from all across the Soviet Union answered the call, volunteering for service in the newly formed 588th Night Bomber Regiment. They were young, just 18 to 22 years old, but they were determined to do their part for the motherland. Undergoing rigorous training, they learned the skills necessary to fly and maintain aircraft, as well as engage in combat if necessary. Soon, they were ready for action. But what kind of planes did these women fly? The truth is that they flew some of the most outdated wooden biplanes that the Soviet Air Force had. These planes were not the most advanced or heavily armed machines, but they were reliable, and most importantly, they were available. The planes were equipped with a small number of machine guns for defensive purposes, but their primary role was to drop bombs on enemy targets. But there was one major obstacle. These planes were loud, and flying at night posed a significant challenge as the pilots had to contend with the noise of the wind and the engine. But the women were undeterred. They developed a technique that would allow them to fly silently through the night sky, cutting their engines and gliding over their targets before dropping their bombs and disappearing into the darkness once again. With the element of surprise on their side, the Night Witches carried out daring raids on German positions behind enemy lines. They targeted military installations, supply depots, troop concentrations, and anything else that could aid the enemy war effort. Their mission was simple: hit the enemy where they least expected it, and make sure that they never saw it coming. As the women flew their missions, word of their exploits spread throughout the German ranks. The Nazis had never seen anything like it before. They called them the Night Witches, and fear quickly turned to terror as the attacks continued and the casualties mounted. German soldiers looked up at the night sky in terror as the sound of the approaching planes filled the air. Whoosh! There was no mistaking that sound. Those planes meant death and destruction. Before long, the Germans knew that they were dealing with something truly terrifying. The Night Witches were more than just pilots. They were legends. And yet, despite their reputation, the Night Witches continued to strike. They carried on bombing raids across the front, taking out key targets with deadly accuracy. But why were the Night Witches so effective? Part of their success can be attributed to the element of surprise. The Germans simply did not see these attacks coming. They were used to being the ones in control, not the ones being attacked. But the Night Witches changed all that. By flying at night, they were able to catch the Germans off guard. They also employed a tactic known as rolling bombing runs. Instead of dropping their bombs in a single pass, the Night Witches would make multiple passes over their target, dropping smaller bombs that caused greater damage than larger bombs would have. This was an unorthodox tactic, but it was highly effective. But it wasn't just the tactics of the Night Witches that made them so successful. It was also the bravery of the women themselves. Despite the danger that they faced every time they took to the skies, the women were fearless. They knew that they were fighting for a greater cause, and that kept them going. They were determined to do whatever it took to win the war and bring their country back from the brink of defeat. But perhaps the most important factor in the success of the Night Witches was the fact that they were women. The Germans simply did not expect women to be capable of such daring feats. They thought that the women would be too afraid to fly at night or too inexperienced to pull off such risky attacks. But the Night Witches proved them wrong. They showed that women were just as capable as men when it came to flying planes and dropping bombs. As the war raged on, the Night Witches continued to strike at the heart of the German war machine. They flew hundreds of missions, dropping thousands of bombs, and taking out some of the most important targets. Behind enemy lines, they were a constant thorn in the side of the Germans, a reminder that no matter how powerful they were not invincible. And as the Soviet army pushed forward, the Night Witches were right there with them, helping to pave the way for victory. But it wasn't easy. The Night Witches faced many dangers. Not only did they have to contend with the elements and the risk of mechanical failure, but they also had to worry about being shot down by the Germans. But they never let that deter them. They knew that their mission was too important to be afraid, and they were willing to risk everything to complete it. One of the most harrowing experiences of the Night Witches was the attack on Krasnodar. The city was being heavily bombed by the Germans, and the Night Witches were sent in to help alleviate the damage. But the Germans were expecting an attack and had set up a strong defense. The Night Witches lost several planes that day, but they still managed to drop their bombs and cause massive damage to the German forces. Another difficult mission for the Night Witches was the attack on Königsberg. The city was heavily fortified, and the Night Witches had to make several passes over their target to cause enough damage to break through the defenses. It was a dangerous mission, but the Night Witches completed it successfully, proving once again that they were fearless in the face of danger. Despite the many challenges they faced, the Night Witches never gave up. They continued to fly their missions until the end of the war, when the Germans finally surrendered. In total, the Night Witches flew over 23,000 bombing missions, dropping more than 1,600 tons of explosives. They were responsible for the deaths of more than 200,000 German soldiers, and they helped to liberate much of the Soviet Union from the clutches of Nazi Germany. But the legacy of the Night Witches goes beyond their military accomplishments. They were symbols of courage, determination, and the power of the human spirit. They showed the world that women were just as capable as men, and they paved the way for future generations of female pilots. After the war, many of the Night Witches went on to live normal lives. They married, had children, and held down jobs. But they never forgot their time in the military and the important role that they played in winning the war. Some of them became teachers, doctors, and engineers, while others continued to fly planes. But no matter what they did, they were always remembered as the Night Witches, the brave women who flew into the night sky and terrorized the enemy with their daring raids. These were the Night Witches, an elite group of female Soviet pilots who took to the skies during World War II. Flying rickety wooden planes, they cut their engines to glide silently through the night, dropping their bombs and then disappearing into the darkness before their enemies even knew what had happened. The Nazis were terrified of them, calling them witches of the night, but they were real. These Soviet women, brave and determined to do their part to defend their country. And in the end, it was their courage and skill that helped turn the tide of war and pave the way for victory. They may not have been witches, but they were warriors who rewrote history. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe for more amazing stories. Thank you for watching. Until next time, stay safe and stay curious.